The courtroom was still, the tension palpable. Mezie stood in the dock, his hands gripping the rail tightly as he stared at the judge's bench. He had once walked with the arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him everything. But now, under the glare of the courtroom lights, he looked small, his confident facade shattered. At the bench sat Judge Adobe Mezie, her black robes a stark contrast to the warmth of her brown skin. Her expression was calm, yet her eyes betrayed the storm within. She looked down at the file before her, flipping through the damning evidence one last time. Mezie, she began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The evidence presented in this court has been overwhelming. You have shown a pattern of violence and disregard for the law, culminating in the tragic death of a young man. This court finds you guilty of manslaughter. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Chiki staggered, his grip tightening on the rail as though it could save him from the weight of her words. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment, Adobe concluded, her voice unwavering. Chief Mezie, seated at the back of the courtroom, felt his heart sink. His only son, the boy he had sacrificed everything for, was now lost to him. He looked at Adobe, his eldest daughter, the same daughter he had discarded years ago. The irony was suffocating. Adobe struck her gavel, ending the session, and walked out with quiet dignity. For her, justice was served, but the cost of this reckoning lingered heavily in her heart. Hi, beautiful people. Thank you for watching Folktales by Promise. Please remember to like, share, and leave a comment below to encourage me. Also, do not forget to subscribe to my channel. How it all started. Many years earlier, the world had looked very different for Chief Mezie. Born into a modest farming family in eastern Nigeria, he had clawed his way up from poverty. As a young man, he traveled to Onitsha, determined to make something of himself. Through grit and ambition, he established a thriving spare parts business, becoming one of the wealthiest men in the community. Success brought respect, but it also brought expectations. In Igbo culture, a man's wealth was meaningless without an heir, a son to carry his name and inherit his legacy. This pressure loomed over Mezie even as he prepared to marry Neka, a beautiful young woman from a nearby village. You've done well for yourself, his uncle had said at the time. Now make sure you choose a woman who can give you strong sons. Neka was everything Mezie thought he needed. Gentle, intelligent, and stunningly beautiful, she seemed the perfect partner. Her parents, protective of their only child, were hesitant when Mezie asked for her hand. Will she continue her education? Her father asked. Neka had dreams of becoming a teacher, and her parents wanted those dreams to be nurtured. Of course, Mezie promised, his smile disarming. Once we are settled, she can return to school. Neka, excited by the prospect of marriage, believed him. Their wedding was a grand affair, filled with music, laughter, and the promise of a bright future. In the first year of their marriage, Neka was happy. Mezie doted on her, and she believed in his vision for their life together. When she became pregnant, her joy was boundless. Perhaps after the baby, she thought, I'll go back to school. But when Adobe was born, a healthy, beautiful daughter, Mezie's enthusiasm waned. A girl, he murmured, though he forced a smile. She's beautiful, just like her mother. With each subsequent pregnancy, Mezie's hope for a son grew. By the time their fourth daughter, Chiamaka, was born, his patience had turned to bitterness. 4 daughters, he said one evening, staring into his glass of palm wine. Not even one son. What have I done to deserve this? Neka, overhearing him, felt a pang of guilt, though she knew it wasn't her fault. She tried to compensate for his disappointment, pouring all her energy into their home and children. But her sacrifices went unnoticed. The whispers of Mezie's kinsmen only added fuel to his frustration. A man without a son is like a tree without roots, they would say, their words stinging like nettles. The pressure became unbearable, and Mezie began to withdraw from his family. At home, his demeanor changed. He stopped playing with his daughters, stopped listening to their laughter. When Adobe proudly showed him her report card, he barely glanced at it. Go help your mother, he muttered, waving her away. Nika tried to protect her children from his growing resentment, but the cracks in their family were impossible to ignore. It was during this time of tension that Ifoma entered Mezie's life. A young woman with striking beauty and a calculating mind, she quickly became his confidant and eventually his mistress. You deserve more, Mezie, she would say, her voice dripping with allure. A man like you needs an heir. Her words were a balm to his wounded pride. When she revealed she was pregnant, claiming the child was a boy, Mezie's resolve crumbled. This is my chance, he thought. But Ifoma had her demands. If you want this son, you must make room for him, she said, her eyes hard. Get rid of that woman and her daughters. The day Mezie shattered his family was etched into Neka's memory with unbearable clarity. The morning had begun like any other. Neka bustled around the kitchen, preparing breakfast, while the girls helped set the table. Mezie sat in the living room, brooding, the weight of Ifoma's ultimatum pressing heavily on him. When the girls excitedly ran to greet him, he waved them off. Adobe, sensing something was wrong, lingered near the doorway, watching her father's sullen face. She exchanged a worried glance with Neka, but neither spoke. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Mezie called Neka into the living room. His voice was cold, his gaze distant. It's time you and the girls left this house. Neka froze, her heart pounding. What are you saying, Mezie? You've given me nothing but daughters, he spat. I need a son to carry my name. There's no place for you here anymore. The words hit her like a blow. Mezie, these are your children. Our children. You can't just throw us away. Mazie's jaw tightened. I've made up my mind. Pack your things and leave. The next morning, Neka and the girls stood at the gate, clutching a few hastily packed bags. The neighbors whispered as they walked past, their pitying gazes cutting into Neka's dignity. Adobe tried to comfort her younger sisters, her voice trembling as she reassured them that everything would be okay. But deep down, even she wasn't sure. Neka was utterly alone. The weight of her circumstances bore down on her like a mountain she could never hope to climb. Mezie had not only turned his back on her and their daughters, but had also ensured that no one else would dare offer them help. His influence in the community was far-reaching, and he wielded it mercilessly. Quiet warnings were sent to his associates, friends, and even casual acquaintances. Cross me by helping that woman and you'll regret it. The unspoken message was clear, and it worked. People who once greeted Nika with warmth now avoided her entirely. Former neighbors pretended not to see her, crossing to the other side of the street whenever she approached. Even the women who had once shared gossip and laughter with her at market stalls now turned their backs, unwilling to risk Mezie's wrath. She was a ghost in her own community, invisible yet watched, her isolation cruelly orchestrated. What made it worse was the financial trap Mezie had left her in. Nika had no savings to fall back on. As a dutiful wife, she had always managed the household with what Mezie provided, stretching the money to feed and clothe the family. She had never questioned him about finances or thought to put anything aside for herself. It seemed unnecessary at the time. Mezie was her husband, the man she trusted, the man who once promised to protect her. Never in her worst nightmares had she imagined that he would cast her out like this, leaving her and their daughters to fend for themselves. And there was no returning to her parents' home either. That door had been closed long ago, permanently. Nneka was an only child, and her parents had passed away within a few years of each other. When her father died, Mezie had persuaded her to sell the family home. "We don't need it," he had said at the time, his voice soothing and persuasive. "The money can go towards something better for us and the children." Grieving and trusting, Nneka had agreed. The house, which held so many memories of her childhood, was sold, and the proceeds went directly into Mezie's account. At the time, it seemed logical, practical even. Now, standing in the harsh reality of her abandonment, she realized she had no safety net. Mazie's carefully planned actions had ensured that she had no refuge, no way out. Stranded and with nowhere to turn, Nneka stood frozen in her despair. The faces of her daughters, wide-eyed with confusion and fear, only deepened the pit of hopelessness in her heart. They looked to her for answers, for reassurance, but she had none to give. The once comfortable life she had built with Mezie had crumbled, and all she had left were her children and the will to keep moving forward, no matter how impossible it seemed. In that moment, Nneka understood the full cruelty of her situation. She was not just abandoned, she was exiled, cut off from the world she had once known. And yet, in the depths of her despair, a spark of resolve flickered. Mezie may have taken everything from her, but he had not taken her spirit. For the sake of her daughters, she would find a way to survive. She had to. The uncompleted building on the outskirts of town was a far cry from the comfort of the home they had left behind. The walls were bare concrete, the floors cold and dusty. At night the wind howled through the open windows, and the girls huddled together for warmth. Nneka worked tirelessly to provide for them. She took on any job she could find, washing clothes, scrubbing floors, and carrying goods in the market. Her hands became calloused, her back sore, but she refused to let her daughters go hungry. One day Adobe approached her mother, her face etched with determination. "Mama, let me help. I can work too." "No," Nneka said firmly. "Your job is to study. You'll finish school and make something of yourself. All of you will." Despite the hardships, the girls excelled in their studies. They shared a single textbook, taking turns reading by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. Adobe often stayed up late, whispering words of encouragement to her sisters. It was a rainy evening when their fragile stability was upended. The owner of the uncompleted building arrived, demanding they vacate immediately. With no choice, Nneka and her daughters gathered their belongings and stepped into the downpour. They wandered the streets searching for shelter. The rain soaked through their clothes, and the youngest, Chiamaka, shivered uncontrollably. Nneka felt her resolve crumbling, her heart breaking as she saw the despair in her children's eyes. It was then that Judge Nicholas found them. He was a retired federal high court judge and a widower who practiced in Lagos all his working life and retired to the east following the death of his beloved wife. Judge Nicholas was driving home from a visit to a friend. He spotted the bedraggled family huddled under a tree. He stopped his car and approached them, his umbrella shielding him from the rain. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Nika looked up, her face streaked with rain and tears. We have nowhere to go. Judge Nicolas studied the family, his heart aching at their plight. Come with me, he said, offering his hand. I'll help you. Judge Nicolas' home was modest but warm, a sanctuary compared to the harshness of the streets. He gave them a room to stay in and ensured they had food and clothing. The next morning, Judge Nicolas sat down with Neka over a warm cup of tea, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. Neka, he began gently, I need to understand what led you and your daughters to be out in the rain, homeless. His voice was steady but laced with compassion, the kind of tone that invited honesty. Neka hesitated, her hands clasped tightly around her teacup. She looked down, gathering the strength to speak. Slowly she began to recount her ordeal. She told him about Mezie's change in behavior, his growing obsession with having a male heir, and the venomous influence of his mistress. Her voice trembled as she described the day Mezie threw her and the girls out, his once loving gaze replaced with cold indifference. Judge Nicholas listened intently, his hands clenched in quiet fury. When she finished, he leaned back, his face dark with anger. What your husband has done is beyond cruel, Nika, he said, his voice tight. He has not only abandoned you, but has robbed you and your daughters of the dignity you deserve. This cannot go unchallenged. I'll contact some of my colleagues, lawyers who can help. We'll take him to court and make him answer for this. Nika looked up alarmed. Please, no, she said, shaking her head firmly. Suing Mezie will not bring back what we've lost. It won't produce the son he wanted, and it certainly won't make him love his daughters. I don't want my children to endure any more cruelty from him. They've suffered enough. Judge Nicholas's expression softened, but the fire in his eyes didn't dim. Are you certain, Nika? A man like that shouldn't be allowed to walk away unpunished. I'm certain, she replied, her voice steady now. What I need isn't revenge, Judge. I need stability for my daughters. They deserve a chance to go to school, to have a future. Please, if you can, give me work. I'll do anything. Just let me earn enough to educate them. Judge Nicholas was silent for a moment, moved by her resolve. Finally, he nodded. If that's what you want, Neka, then so be it. I'll make you my house manager. It's an important role, and I trust you to handle it with care. As for your daughters, he continued, his voice softening further, I'll ensure they receive the best education possible. You don't have to worry about school fees. Consider it my responsibility now. Tears welled in Neka's eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. Thank you, Judge Nicholas, she whispered. Thank you for giving us hope. He smiled warmly, his kind eyes glinting with affection. Stay here, Neka, he said firmly. You and your daughters belong here now. I've lived alone for too long, and having you all around has brought life back to this house. Let it be your home too. From that moment, a new chapter began for Neka and her daughters. George Nicholas became not only their benefactor, but also a pillar of strength and a surrogate father figure. Under his roof, they found not just shelter, but a sense of family they thought they had lost forever. Over time, he became a father figure to the girls, teaching them values of integrity, resilience, and kindness. Neka took on the role of house manager, overseeing the household with efficiency and care. The girls returned to school, their spirits lifted by the stability Judge Nicholas provided. Years passed, and the girls thrived. Adobe graduated at the top of her class, followed by her sisters. Each of them pursued careers in law. inspired by Judge Nicholas's wisdom and example. Meanwhile, Mezie's world seemed perfect, or so he thought. Ifoma gave birth to his son, Chike, and Mezie lavished him with attention and gifts. Chike was the center of his universe, the heir he had longed for. But Mezie's indulgence came at a cost. Chike grew up spoiled and entitled, believing he could do no wrong. As a child, he bullied other children, his father always quick to pay off complaints. When he stole from a shop at 13, Mezie brushed it off. Boys will be boys, he said, handing the shopkeeper a wad of cash. You're my legacy, Mezie would tell him. Don't let anyone stand in your way. But Chike took those words to heart in the worst possible way. As Chike grew older, his behavior escalated. He gambled, drank, and started hanging out with a rough crowd. He was arrested multiple times for petty crimes, but Medzie's influence always secured his release. Chike lived for the thrill of the night, where loud music and flashing neon lights masked the emptiness of his days. From one club to the next, he and his crew of equally wayward friends were the kings of the city's underbelly, throwing money around like confetti and basking in the attention it brought. His father, Chief Mezie, sponsored this reckless lifestyle without question, turning a blind eye to the consequences. You're my heir, Chike, Mezie often told him. You don't need to stress about school when you'll inherit everything I've built. With that assurance, Chike saw no reason to pursue an education. He started attending school merely for appearances, more interested in making a scene than sitting in a classroom. He flouted the rules, skipped classes, and picked fights, reveling in the chaos he caused. Teachers and administrators grew weary of his antics, but Mezier's influence and bribes kept Chike from facing any real consequences. Eventually, his behavior became too disruptive to ignore. At one prestigious school, he was caught leading a gang of boys in vandalizing school property. The headmaster demanded his expulsion. Mezie, as always, tried to smooth things over with money, but the school stood firm. Embarrassed yet defiant, Chike announced that school wasn't for him. Why waste time in school when I'll have more money than any of those teachers could dream of? He scoffed. From that point on, Chike fully embraced a life of indulgence. His nights were spent in smoke-filled rooms, his hands clutching bottles of expensive liquor, his pockets stuffed with his father's money. Drugs became a frequent escape, and he was rarely seen without a cigarette or joint between his fingers. His friends, most of whom latched onto him for his wealth, encouraged his every vice. Chike, you're living the life, they would cheer, laughing as he bought another round of drinks for the group. But beneath the surface, Chike's world was spiraling out of control. His behavior escalated. He wrecked expensive cars in street races, skipped out on bills at luxury hotels, and even had brushes with the law. One night, after a drunken brawl in a high-end club, he was arrested for assault. Mezie, as always, bailed him out before the case could go to court. You're just young and wild, Mezie told him. It's normal for boys your age. Chike took his father's indulgence as a license to do whatever he pleased. His drug use deepened, and his circle of friends grew darker. They introduced him to harder substances, and soon Chike was frequenting places even his friends wouldn't dare to visit. The lines between partying and self-destruction blurred. Despite his recklessness, Chike never questioned the path he was on. He was invincible, or so he believed. His father's wealth and influence shielded him from the consequences of his actions, and the few moments of doubt he had were quickly drowned in alcohol or masked by the haze of drugs. The community began to take notice. That boy is a menace, whispered neighbors. He'll bring shame to his father one day. Others pitied Mezie, assuming Chike's behavior was just youthful rebellion. But those closest to the family knew the truth. Mezie's blind devotion to his son had created a monster, one who saw himself as untouchable. For Chike, the nights grew longer, the thrills harder to find. What began as fun and freedom became a desperate cycle of excess, an unquenchable thirst for more. He didn't realize it then, but his life was careening toward a breaking point, one that even his father's wealth and power couldn't save him from. It was another loud electric night at one of the most exclusive clubs in the city. The air was thick with smoke, pulsing music, and the glow of neon lights. Chike, as always, was at the center of it all. Surrounded by his entourage of equally reckless friends and fawning girls, he danced wildly under the flashing strobe lights. His shirt was open halfway, his gold chain catching the light as he moved. His reputation as the king of the nightlife was well earned, and his presence demanded attention. Hours into the night, Chike and his group retreated to the VIP section, a plush area cordoned off with velvet ropes. They lounged on luxurious couches, laughing boisterously as drinks flowed freely. Chick lit a cigarette, exhaling a cloud of smoke as he surveyed the crowd below. His friends hyped him up, clapping him on the back as if he were a celebrity. "Boss, tonight is lit," one of them shouted, raising his glass. Chick smirked, flicking ash onto the floor. "This is just the beginning," he said, leaning back with a look of smug satisfaction. A waiter approached their table, balancing a tray of expensive cocktails. The crowd and chaos made the waiter unsteady, and as he leaned forward to serve Chike's group, the tray tipped slightly, spilling a drink onto Chike's lap. For a moment there was stunned silence. Then Chike's face twisted with fury. "Are you blind?" he roared, standing abruptly. Before the waiter could respond, Chick slapped the tray out of his hands, sending the remaining drinks crashing to the floor. "Do you know who I am? Do you?" The young waiter, trembling, fell to his knees. "Please, sir, I'm so sorry," he begged, his hands clasped. "It was an accident." But Chick wasn't interested in apologies. "An accident!" he spat, kicking the waiter in the chest. The young man toppled backward, gasping for air. Chick's friends erupted in cheers, egging him on. "Show him who's boss, Chike!" one of them shouted. "You're lucky he's even letting you kneel here," another added with a sneer. The waiter crawled toward Chike, still pleading. Chike, drunk with power and intoxicated by the adulation of his friends, stepped on the waiter's hand with deliberate cruelty, grinding his heel into the young man's fingers. In the next section of the club, a young man had been watching the scene unfold. Unable to stand it any longer, he jumped to his feet and rushed over. "What's wrong with you?" he shouted, shoving Chike away from the waiter. "He said it was an accident. You have no right to treat him like this." Chike, irritated and enraged, turned to face his challenger. The man was tall and athletic, his stance firm and unyielding. The waiter scrambled to the side as the two squared off, the tension in the room escalating. "Who do you think you are, stepping into my business?" Chike snarled, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Do you know who I am?" "I know you're a bully," the young man shot back, "and someone needs to teach you a lesson." Chick's friends began to gather behind him, their mocking laughter fueling the confrontation. The crowd around the VIP section turned their attention to the brewing fight, phones coming out to record. Chicky lunged at the man and fists began to fly. The fight was chaotic, with punches thrown and tables knocked over. But Chike wasn't looking for a fair fight. In the chaos, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. Before anyone could react, he thrust it into the young man's side. The man staggered back, his hand clutching his wound, his eyes wide with shock. Within seconds, he collapsed to the floor. Blood pooled around him as the music in the club came to a screeching halt. Gasps filled the air, and people screamed as the gravity of the situation sank in. Unknown to Chike, the young man he had just stabbed was the son of the commissioner of police. The call to the authorities was immediate. Chike's bravado crumbled as police officers stormed into the club. His friends scattered like rats, but there was no escape for Chike. He was arrested on the spot, his hands cuffed behind his back. For the first time in his life, Chike realized his father's influence might not save him. When Mezie received the call about Chike's arrest, he was furious. "This is a misunderstanding," he barked into the phone. "Do you know who my son is?" But even Mezier's confidence wavered when he learned the identity of the victim. His efforts to use his connections hit a wall. The commissioner of police was adamant. Justice would be served. No amount of money or influence could make this go away. Chike was charged with manslaughter, and the trial date was set. On the first day of the hearing, Mezie was determined to find a way out. "Money answereth all things," he muttered to himself. "I'll offer an amount they can't refuse." He arrived at the courthouse early, waiting by the judge's chambers with an envelope of cash tucked under his arm. The judge, he had been told, was a newly inducted, brilliant, no-nonsense young woman. Mezie smirked to himself. Everyone has a price, he thought. As the door to the chambers opened, the judge approached. Mezie's smug grin froze as recognition dawned. Standing before him, in her black judicial robes, was Adobe, his eldest daughter. "Adobe," he stammered, his voice a mixture of excitement and shame. "My daughter, is it really you?" Adobe stopped in her tracks, her expression hardening. "Chief Mezie," she said coolly, addressing him formally. "What are you doing here?" Mezie fumbled for words. I I wanted to speak to you before the hearing," he began. "It's about your brother. Please, Adobe, he's young. He's made a mistake. You're his sister. Surely you can help him." Adobe's eyes narrowed, her voice firm. "If your son Chike is found guilty, he will face the consequences of his actions. My role as a judge is to ensure justice, not to bend the law for anyone." Mezier's heart sank. He had expected warmth, nostalgia, perhaps even a chance to reconcile. Instead, he was met with the unwavering professionalism of a daughter who had long since moved past the father who had abandoned her. In the courtroom, Neka sat proudly in the front row, her daughters by her side. They had come to watch Adobe preside over the case, each of them filled with admiration for their sister. The woman on the bench was no longer the girl who had once cried for her father's love. She was a symbol of strength, justice, and triumph over adversity. Mezie, seated at the back, felt the weight of their presence. He had lost his family once, and now, as he watched Adobe prepare to deliver the verdict, he realized just how much he had sacrificed for an empty legacy. The courtroom grew silent as Adobe began to speak, her voice steady and clear. This was not just a trial for Chike, it was the culmination of decades of choices, consequences, and reckonings. When the verdict was read, the room fell silent. "Chike Mezie," Adobe said, her voice firm, "this court finds you guilty of manslaughter. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment." Chike's knees buckled, and Mezie buried his face in his hands. The weight of his decisions crashed down on him. Outside the courtroom, Mezie approached Neka and their daughters. "I was wrong," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I abandoned you, and I've paid the price. Please forgive me. Nika looked at him, her expression unreadable. We've already forgiven you, Mezie, but forgiveness doesn't mean we can forget. Adobe stepped forward. We've built a life without you. Judge Nicholas has been more of a father to us than you ever were. Mezie watched as they walked away, the family he had forsaken, now stronger and united. Back at Judge Nicholas's home, Nika and her daughters celebrated their journey. They had overcome unimaginable hardships and emerged stronger. For Mezie, the wealth he had accumulated now felt hollow, a stark reminder of what he had lost. His legacy, he realized too late, was not in his son or material wealth, but in the family he had failed to cherish. The end. Morale of the story. True legacy lies in the love and values we pass on to those we cherish, not in material wealth or societal expectations. Neglecting the bonds of family for fleeting desires leads to regret, while forgiveness and resilience pave the way to redemption and strength. Hello, beautiful people. Thank you for your support. Thank you so much for always listening to and watching my stories. Thank you for liking. Thank you for commenting and sharing my stories. Please continue to stick with me. Keep liking, keep sharing, and continue dropping your wonderful comments. Most importantly, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It would mean a lot to me. Thank you.